Hello, class. On Monday, I asked each of you to prepare a series of questions that would coincide with what we talk about today. And a common theme that I saw in each of them that I tried to simplify into a small group of questions that I worked to answer were: what do we do if we see racism? What do we do if we're the victim of it? Does racism still exist? And what are examples of modern day racism? How does racism work now? So, with that in mind, I'm going to begin with a small portion of a story that works to address some of those questions and some of those concerns. It's called Something Happened in Our Town, a child's story about racial injustice, and it features two children who learn about the same event but get different descriptions from their parents. And we'll discuss that and some of those differences after. Emma and Josh heard that something happened in their town. Why did the police shoot that man? Can police go to jail? Something bad happened in our town. The news was on the TV, the radio, and the internet. The grown-ups didn't think the kids knew about it. But the kids in Miss Garcia's class heard some older kids talking about it, and they had questions. After school, Emma asked her mother, "Why did the police shoot that man?" "It was a mistake," said her mother. "I feel sad for the man and his family." "Yes, the police thought he had a gun," said her father. "It wasn't a mistake," said her sister Liz. "The cops shot him because he was black." Emma was confused. "He is brown, not black," she said. "Some black people have dark brown skin, and some have light brown skin," Emma's father explained. "Black usually means African American. Most of their ancestors were brought here from Africa as slaves." In another house, Josh asked his mother, "Can police go to jail?" "Yes," said his mother. "Why do you ask?" "That white policeman who shot the black man," said Josh. "Will he go to jail?" "What he did was wrong," said his mother. "But he won't go to jail," said his father. "Why not?" asked Josh. "Cops stick up for each other," said Josh's brother Malcolm. "And they don't like black men." Josh was confused. "Why not? Some police are black." "You're right," said his mother. "Uncle James is a police officer. And so is my friend Kenya. There are many cops, black and white, who make good choices," said his father. "But we can't always count on them to do what's right." So let's move back a bit to a time before each of you, a time before me. The 1950s, the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, which was a time in American history where people of color, where black people, stood up and fought for their rights, fought for the ability to become full citizens of the United States. They fought to vote, to gain full employment, to work. They fought for freedom and liberation, which came in a number of forms, particularly schools. So briefly, I'd like each of you to look to your left, to your right, forward, backward. And I'd like for you to describe what you see in each of your fellow students, your friends. Their skin color, many of them may be black, many of them may be white, so on and so forth. Describe their hair. Mine, curlier than many of yours. If I grow it out, I can have an afro. When it was long, I had braids. My eyes, a dark shade of brown. These differences tie into race and our concept of it, our understanding of it. Race are the features, the phenotypal features that essentially make us. The shape of our nose, of our lips, the color of our eyes, the thickness of our hair, all of these different things determine whether a person is black, a person is white. They also help us to learn what the person's ethnicity is. But racism comes in when a dominant group, places restrictions on another group based upon that group's skin color. And racism still exists even today. We see it all the time through policing, through over-policing. Modern-day racism often comes in that form. A famous example is a man named George Floyd, who is no longer alive because he was murdered by a police officer. The police officer's name was Derek Chauvin. A common slogan regarding George Floyd's death is "I can't breathe," because that's how he was killed. He was no longer allowed to breathe because the officer, Chauvin, kept his knee on George Floyd's back for almost 9 minutes. The other officers on the scene did nothing to stop him. They allowed him to continue his assault on Mr. Floyd until ultimately Mr. Floyd died. And that goes back to what we saw in the book, where the black child's brother said, "Cops stick up for each other, and they don't like black men." I don't want to branch into those kinds of bold statements because they're not fair. There are many good cops. Black, white, otherwise. You may know a black cop. You may know a white cop. But it's important to recognize that police in our society have a lot of power. And that power can be the cause of bad things. Branching back to the past, there was a boy who was a few years older than each of you currently are. His name was Emmett Till. He was a child from Chicago who visited Mississippi. And he was brutally murdered, once again in 1955, for whistling at a white woman in her family store. There are questions as to if he actually whistled or not. But that aside, 4 days after this particular event, the woman's husband and her brother tracked Emmett down, making him carry a cotton gin fan to the bank of a nearby river. They forced him to take off his clothes, beat him until he was nearly dead, gouged out his eye. They shot him. They threw his body into the river. While these men were not police, they also faced no legal ramifications. There was no punishment in a simpler way for their actions. It was a cruel kind of inhumanity, and it was allowed to be. These kinds of allowances can be seen throughout history. But we fight to move past them. We fight to progress as a society. We fight to make these kinds of reformations that we need to be more fair to all people of color. To be more accurate, well, not accurate, bad choice of words, to be more kind and empathetic. Take, for example, the example of Emmett. He grew up in Chicago, a town with its own racial issues, but not the kind of segregation that he would have seen in Mississippi. Segregation essentially means separation, but a kind that is enforced through the law and through power. Power, which can come in many forms, police, for example. Now, remember when I asked each of you to look and acknowledge the racial makeup of many of your classmates, many of your friends? Some black, some white, so on and so forth. In the past, individuals of different colors would not have been allowed to attend school together. This changed with a Supreme Court decision called Brown versus Board of Education. And that's a small example of the kinds of changes that we saw as a result of the Civil Rights Movement. And like I mentioned earlier, my job as an educator is to prepare you for modern society, to teach you about past societies, and to give you strategies, or at least an understanding of how to advocate for each other, for yourselves, and to help build a more fair, a more just world. We have a lot of room to grow. A part of that comes through answering your questions. What do we do if we see racism? A lot of individuals do that. They protest. They go to rallies. They join their friends. And they confront the injustices that they see. If you're the victim of it, speaking out, calling in, trying to teach individuals, if they can be taught, that some of their actions are unkind or wrong or unjust. Racism is still a very real thing, and sometimes it goes beyond just saying a mean thing to another person because they're a different skin color than you. Sometimes there can be real power behind it, like in the example of George Floyd and many other black men who have been killed by police officers. That isn't the only way. Sometimes they're arrested unjustly, placed in jail or prison for a very long time. This kind of power bleeds into our questions of racism and the things that we face. It also bleeds into how we examine it and how we learn about it. So it's important for me to teach you to be comfortable with these conversations, to introduce these concepts to you, so that you can have these conversations with your friends, with your parents, and gain a better understanding. I want all of you to take away at least a small glimpse of what racism is, and I'm happy to answer more questions that you may have. But for the sake of, well, time, I'm going to end this here. And we're going to move on, well, to the next part of our lesson in regards to this. In short, though, racism is something that happened in the past. Racism is also something that happens today. And it's something that all of us must be aware of and must be willing to confront when it occurs. So, I hope I've pushed you in that direction at the very least.